today. Harry, we wanted to look at this issue because more and more we're seeing this on our screens, specifically because of what we're seeing in Calais, but it's much broader than just what's happening in Calais.
It's far broader than what's happening in Calais, Marcus. I mean, it's very pertinent to our discussions because although MENA analysis looks at what happens in the MENA region, we've often said that the ramifications of what happens in the MENA region can be felt across the whole of the European Union and the Europe continent as well. So in a sense, we have Calais, but we also have recently, we've been hearing about the refugees and asylum seekers overwhelming the borders in Macedonia, Greece, Italy, the boat people coming here. And there is, of course, the increasing paranoia in this country, and I use the word paranoia advisedly, of refugees and asylum seekers coming to the UK. Do we have the space for them? What are the procedures? What do we do with those people if and when they manage to get to the British Isles? So in a sense, all these issues are pertinent to our discussion because those people who are fleeing from Syria, from Iraq and from other countries are human beings just like you and I. They happen to actually be running away, some of them because of the dangers of wars and uprisings, some of them probably for socioeconomic reasons. But look at what's happening recently. I mean, Germany itself, this week, President Hollande and Chancellor Merkel met to discuss the situation. They addressed the idea of harmonizing EU laws or at least policies in relation to refugees and asylum seekers. I think that is like seeking the Holy Grail. It will not really work within a Europe-wide consensus. But also Germany, for instance, by the end of this year will have received 800,000 refugees or asylum seekers. In the UK, and Ocean could correct me if I'm wrong, there are only 150 and we're already blogging about it. So just imagine the differences between those two countries. It is not fair to have some countries carry the burden whilst others just don't.
So I'm going to throw you in the deep end here, Ocean. Tough question to start. Are we taking our fair share of asylum seekers, migrants, refugees, whichever term we're going to use?
In terms of our fair share, so that's mainly dictated by what we have to follow in terms of the regulations, that the systems and the procedures in which whether we take these asylum seekers or not. Obviously, many have difficulty in getting into UK in the first place, but when they do arrive, the mechanism in place is the Dublin regulations. It's a system in which Europe tries to share the responsibility of processing asylum claims, and the UK very much has the benefit of being so far away from where the overwhelming majority of migrants arrive in Europe in the first place, that it can send them back under this mechanism, the Dublin regulations. So in terms of that, the UK is very well protected in terms of politically trying to deter migrants from coming to the UK, knowing that most of these migrants know that whether they're refugees or economic migrants, they know that they'll be returned to the first European state that they entered.
So in terms of, the UK being this place where it seems so many people want to come because they see it maybe as prosperous, they see it as a land that they can have a future in, is it a suggestion that there's so many people wanting to go into the UK, but there's so fewer spaces than there are in neighbouring countries, so it's even harder to get into the UK? Is that right?
It is hard to get to the UK in the first place, that's right. The places in the border states of Europe, at the moment, there's many challenges in the UK courts in terms of the reception conditions in those countries, the accommodation, the time it takes for those asylum claims to be processed within the system, within the European directives which are put in place to make sure that migrants are processed in timely fashion, they're given accommodation and humane living conditions. So as those deteriorate, the migrants are moving towards UK, and the UK will have to obviously adapt to that eventually. But for the time being, UK hasn't felt much of the burden.
Well, we often hear about the UK being a Christian country, and the Prime Minister, David Cameron, has often said that. But we know one of the Christian values is love your neighbour and look out for other people. Is there a case that the UK should be taking on more of a burden?
It should be taking on more of the responsibility. Unfortunately, in the press, we hear floods and gangs of migrants coming to Europe. Unfortunately, from what I've seen in terms of my profession, and I see it firsthand, these are vulnerable people. Half of the world's refugees are children. Many of them men stay back, or unfortunately can't travel, can't leave the country. They're fighting. So many of them are women and children. And yes, we need a better system in place to take more of the responsibility.
Because if you read the Daily Mail or the Daily Express, Harry, you'll get a very different perspective on this, and it's shut the doors and don't let anyone in.
Which is why I use the term paranoia when I said that we're a bit too worried about what's happening, and I gave figures to compare what Germany has taken in terms of applications for asylum versus what the UK has taken in. I think in a sense we are very well protected, but I think for us it is politically expedient for the political parties to pump up the issue of refugees and immigration in order to score political wins. But in a sense, what is happening across in Italy, what is happening, I'll give you another simple example. Forget Germany, which is a financially stable country. Forget even Italy, which was basically beginning to keel over. Look at Greece. Greece is really in a very fragile economic situation. And if you go to one of the many islands in Greece, for instance, Kos, spelled K-O-S, if people want to Google it, you will see that that little island is flooded with Syrian and Iraqi and other refugees who've basically come there waiting to find a way to move from there elsewhere. And those who are flooding the Macedonian borders, for instance, aren't going there because they want to stay in Macedonia. They're going there because their ultimate destination is Hungary. Why Hungary? Because Hungary is an EU country, and the minute you get into Hungary, then you are allowed pretty much to roam across mainland continental Europe, and eventually, whether it is by train, by boat, by lorry, some of them, yes, they do think that the UK is a land of opportunity, and therefore they would wish to come in. But one point that Oshin stressed on, and I would like to re-stress it, is this idea that when you have somebody leaving Syria and gets into Europe, the first destination where that man or woman or child set their feet in is the first country that they are being received in. Therefore, that country would have the responsibility of dealing with those refugees. So if you go from that country to another country, then the other country would say, well, you didn't stop here first, go back to Italy, to Greece, etc. However, that's the point that also Oshin made, which is that the institutional framework of those first host countries is weakening increasingly, and there have been challenges in the court whereby if you can prove that in Greece, somewhere else, the situation and the structure is not strong enough to accommodate you, then you can stay in another country. I really think at the end of the day, Marcus, and I'd like to hear what Oshin thinks about that, but at the end of the day, the issue is not really an issue so much of numbers and the law. The law is important because if somebody comes into the UK and goes into OTS Solicitors, which is where Oshin works, if he or she, as a refugee or an asylum seeker, has a legal representation, the chances of that person's application being considered favorably by the Home Office is much higher than if somebody were to come and sort of rely on Providence or on the Almighty or on a concatenation of favorable circumstances. And therefore, a lot of those lawyers, which is why he's sitting in studio tonight with us, a lot of those lawyers are actually facilitating this course, but by facilitating the process, they also know that this idea that some of our politicians are throwing at us, that there's so many people at the gates that we're going to be overwhelmed, is simply not true.
Oshin, your thoughts in response?
Yeah, so definitely legal representation is very important for anyone seeking to claim asylum or for any other humanitarian reasons they need protection in the UK. The key is information. So whether they have legal representation or whether the authorities have a responsibility to provide information on whether, in terms of the rules, in terms of the procedures, and all of this needs to be explained in their native language. It's a minefield in the UK. To claim asylum isn't as if you just enter the country and you're given housing and you're given your refugee status. It's very complicated in terms of the system, the evidence that needs to be produced, the procedures. So yes, I mean, anyone claiming asylum in the UK or fleeing persecution or any humanitarian disaster, they would need a lot more information. I think we don't do enough of that in terms of this country when we are receiving
and it's interesting, Marcus, because one of the things I put in my blog, I said that Oshin is also quite keen on judicial reviews. Yeah. In other words, when you basically apply and your application is rejected, then you have the right to revisit the decision of the Home Office and ask for the judge to look at the negative answer and decide why it was negative and act on it. So in a way, there are many legal avenues. But of course, what happens is, when I mentioned legal representation, it wasn't because we're both lawyers. It's because a lot of those people are destitute. They come without two pennies to rub together. So whilst it might be very interesting for X, Y, or Z to come into this country and have Oshin's firm or another firm deal with their application, a lot of these people don't have money to buy food, let alone to go and pay a hefty bill by a firm in order to be represented legally. However, the unfortunate reality is that a lot of those people would be viewed more favorably if they had a solicitor batting for them. But what I would like to mention are two things. Oshin again mentioned the issue of information. Let me elaborate on that. When a refugee comes into Europe, they're usually, if they're lucky, given a piece of paper in the language of the country in which they're stepping into, which says, this is what you are, who you are, what you're doing. These people wouldn't have a clue what that paper means. So when he said information, if that information were in different languages, then most of those refugees from Syria and Iraq, for instance, or elsewhere, Libya and what have you, speak Arabic. They would understand much better their reality and deal accordingly with that reality. So information is very important. But the other thing that is also very important is, I started off by sort of shrugging off the idea of harmonization of EU laws on this, which is what Merkel and Hollande were trying to do. That will not work. But the EU is an idea. It's more than just a mechanism. We in the UK look at the EU in terms of pounds and pence. We should look at the EU in terms of an idea that brings Europe together. And if we are a continent of 27, 28 member states, if we don't help each other, if there is no collective responsibility on a larger scale, then we are really, really selling a lot of fear, which at times is founded. I do not deny that, but at other times it is also unfounded. When I was growing up and studying law, my favorite all-time favorite judge in the Court of Appeal was Lord Denning. He was the master of the rolls, and he often used to say, the law is a means to an end. It is not the end in itself. So look at Oshin not as an end, but a means to an end.
Oshin, this situation's not going away, anytime soon. It's only going to kind of increase as the months go by. What can or what should our government be doing to support? Maybe support's the wrong word, but to help these people as they try to find out where their future lies? Well,
there's many solutions that have been proposed. I think the truth of the matter is every person is going to try to better their lives. So whether they're running from persecution or hardship in their country, they're going to try to go somewhere better. And this is what we need to face up to. Europe needs to, I think, be a bit more... it needs to come together, and we need to share the responsibility. Most of the policies are borne out through responsibility shifting to other member states, and this hardly protects the people, the vulnerable people that are entering Europe. What the UK can do is obviously take on board some of that responsibility, and some have suggested a quota system to do that. And I believe Europe needs to get together and discuss a good system for the quota system to work, in terms of whether fixed numbers or percentage of the overall numbers entering Europe should be shared, how that should be shared. Information exchange is really important, because certain family members are split up. A husband and wife could be split up. Wife and child could be split from their father. So, I mean, and the best interest of the child obviously needs to take paramount consideration. Basically a better way of sharing, a real way of sharing responsibility, not shifting responsibility around Europe.
Oshin, time's got away from us, so we're going to have to say goodbye. But thank you for joining us on the programme today. Just finally, you know, if anyone's listening now and they do have people who are falling into the categories that we've been talking about in regards to trying to find refuge here, OTS Solicitors, just tell us a little bit more about that and how we can find out information.
Okay, OTS Solicitors, we specialise in immigration law. Clients can log on to our website. It's www.otssolicitors.co.uk.
OTSsolicitors.co.uk.
And he writes blogs, legal blogs, which would actually be quite interesting, not only to lawyers, but to laypersons as well.
There you go. And you can find them on the website?
Absolutely, in the news section.
There you go. Oshin, thank you so much for joining us on Middle East North Africa Analysis this evening.